So the peripheral nervous system is the nervous system that comes off of the brain and spinal cord. So remember we talked about in part 1 of our video, the cranial nerves come from the brain, so those nerves branch off of the brain. The spinal nerves come off the spinal cord. And then we have some nerve cell bodies that are outside the central nervous system that are clustered into little swellings called ganglia. So those are called ganglia. So cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and ganglia make up these peripheral nervous system. So when you look at a nerve, whether it's a cranial nerve or spinal nerve, what we see is they are bundles of myelinated axons. So the whole thing is a nerve, but inside of it are many, many axons. Some are carrying sensory information, some are carrying motor information, and they're myelinated for quick processing. So we can see when I look in this microscope view here, the little white circles with the dark centers, the white is the myelin and the dark center is the axon in the center of that myelin. So they're bundles of many, many, many axons. So lots of information coming and going through these nerves, and just like wires in a thick cord, coming from the telephone wires. Those lots of information there, lots of different fibers, there's lots of different neurons in a nerve. So a nerve and a neuron are not the same thing. A neuron is one single nerve cell, where a nerve is a bundle of these neurons or nerve fibers. So looking at the nerves that come off the brain, there's 12 pairs of nerves, and they're listed by Roman numerals. When we look at them, these are the 12 cranial nerves, again coming off the brain, shown in yellow here. You recognize the 2 large optic nerves. Notice that information comes in the optic nerve, crosses over, and goes to the other side of the brain. So we find that these 2 nerves here, actually the information crosses over to the other side. So, but our brain is able to process that information and allow us to see things normally, even though that information is crossing over. So we have the cranial nerves for vision here. That's cranial nerve number, so the optic nerve is cranial nerve number 2. Cranial nerve number 1 is for smell, so these 2 are for smell. And then we have cranial nerve number 3, the ocular motor, that controls the movement of our eye muscles. So I'm not going to go through all of the cranial nerves and expect you to know all of their function, but you should know that there are nerves that come off the brain that are important for facial movement, tongue movement, swallowing, eye movement, hearing, smell, taste. Those cranial nerves have those functions. And there's an important cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve, and that is one that controls most of our internal organs. So that's a really important one. So that's cranial nerve number 10. That's the vagus nerve, and it goes to the heart, to the lungs, to the digestive tract, throughout the body. And it's really important for sensation, receiving information and sending information, motor information to those organs. So the vagus nerve is a very, very important nerve that branches from the brain to most of the body. So the spinal nerves are those nerves that come off the spinal cord. There's 31 pairs of those. So there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves that come off the brain and 31 pairs of spinal nerves that come off the spinal cord. Again, they have sensory portions and motor portions. Remember the dorsal root we looked at in the spinal cord carries sensory information, and the ventral root contains motor information going out from the spinal cord. So when we look at the peripheral nervous system, then what it controls, what those nerve controls, is divided into a couple of different divisions. The somatic nervous system is the control of skeletal muscle. So when we look at the motor output of nerves to the organs of the body, if it's a skeletal muscle under voluntary control, those neurons make up the somatic nervous system. Excuse me. So the somatic nervous system controls skeletal muscles, tendons, skin, all under voluntary control. Although some of them may operate under reflexes. Like I said, when we tap your knee, the tendon below your knee and the knee kicks out, that's not voluntary, but it's still part of the somatic nervous system. So somatic nervous system is voluntary skeletal muscle. So the neurons that control voluntary skeletal muscle make up the somatic nervous system. So we already talked about a reflex arc and kind of how that works. So we're not going to go through that again, but just know the pathway. The sensory receptor in the skin, say if you poked yourself with a needle, what's that sensory receptor, that sensory neuron would carry that impulse into the spinal cord via the dorsal root. It would jump across to the motor side, which is the ventral root, via an interneuron. That's what this purple neuron, it's an interneuron. So instead of going up to the brain right away, it jumps over to the other side, comes right back out, and contracts those biceps muscles to pull that finger away from that sharp object. So it's called a reflex arc because it comes in and arcs right back out to get a response to protect us from danger. Now, shortly after that, you're going to feel that pinprick and be aware of it at the level of the brain, but you already pulled your hand away before the brain was aware of it, and that's why it's called a reflex, because it doesn't require the brain to respond. So another part of our motor response, we have neurons that we said are in charge of controlling voluntary skeletal muscle, and those neurons make up the somatic nervous system. Now the autonomic nervous system is contain neurons that control smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So these are under involuntary control, but they're very important for keeping us alive because we need our digestive tract, our heart, our lungs, our blood vessels, everything to be working properly with the help of these neurons that make up the autonomic nervous system. So autonomic is the involuntary control, those neurons that are controlling cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands under involuntary control. And it's divided into two other subdivisions called the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So when you're looking at those involuntary organs like our heart and lungs, the sympathetic nervous system is something that allows us to prepare for fight or flight or stressful situations, and the parasympathetic nervous system is for rest and digest or calm situations. So when we are stressed out, our neurons of the autonomic nervous system what's dominating will be those sympathetic neurons that are, stimulated under stressful conditions to cause heart rate to increase, our airways to dilate, our heart to contract a little harder, our pupils will dilate. So we have these involuntary organ responses that are stimulated by sympathetic neurons during stressful situations. But if we're relaxing and reading a book, then the parasympathetic neurons of the autonomic nervous system are dominating, and our heart is beating slowly, our eyes are not dilating, and our smooth muscle of our digestive tract is working on digesting our food, and again, we're resting and digesting when the parasympathetic neurons are dominating. But at one time in our body, some of our sympathetic neurons are active and some of our parasympathetic neurons are active, and we're in a relaxed state, but we have, normal blood pressure and heart rate and some constriction of our blood vessels to keep our blood pressure up. So both of these groups of neurons are active, but when we're in a very relaxed state, the parasympathetic neurons are active, and when we're stressed out and ready to fight or flight, then the sympathetic neurons are active. All of these are involuntary and just respond depending on what the state of the body is. So if a person is a chronically anxious person, then the sympathetic nervous system is going to be dominating, which is going to lead to eventual high blood pressure, a hard-working heart, and suppressed digestion because, the parasympathetic neurons are in charge of digestion. So if a person is anxious, they're not going to be focused, the body isn't focusing on digestion, and those neurons are not active. So that can lead to ulcers and weight loss or weight gain, depending if people are eating to kind of help settle an upset stomach, and just depends on the individual. But sympathetic neurons means, fight or flight, stressful responses by the body. Parasympathetic is rest and digest, relaxing responses like digesting our food, urinating, some of those just moist, wet saliva, some of those rest and digest activities, having a bowel movement. Those are parasympathetic neurons dominating that result in, digestion of food and bowel movement, urination, relaxation. So looking at this kind of flow chart here, remember the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord are always communicating with each other, but sensory information comes into the brain and spinal cord, and motor information leaves the brain and spinal cord, and that motor response, if the response from the nervous system is to stimulate voluntary skeletal muscle, that's the somatic motor nerves that are active. But if we're looking to stimulate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands that are under involuntary control, that's the autonomic motor nerves that are dominating. And those autonomic nerves can be further divided into sympathetic or parasympathetic neurons. So again, if we're speeding things up, it's the sympathetic. If we're slowing things down, it's the parasympathetic in terms of rest and digest and fight or flight. So if we look at each of these divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic neurons we can see come off the middle portion of the spinal cord, the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord, and the parasympathetic neurons come off the brainstem and the sacral region of the spinal cord. So where those neurons come off the spinal cord differs, but they notice that each of those, whether it's a sympathetic neuron or a parasympathetic neuron, a lot of them go to the same organ, and one is going to prepare that organ for fight or flight or to rest and digest. There's just a couple of organs that don't really have both divisions. For example, let's see if I can find one on this diagram. It doesn't look like it's shown on this diagram. Well, here we can see, well, it looks like, yeah, one example would be the skin. Our sweat glands, our rector pili muscles are stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system only. But it's not important that you know all the organs and which neurons, they are stimulated by, but you can just see that both neurons stimulate, the same organ. One will prepare it for, remember the sympathetic neuron, if it carries an impulse, an action potential, that'll be, fight or flight, and if this parasympathetic neuron system is dominating, that'll prepare it for rest and digest. So in the case of the eye, you would dilate the eye for fight or flight so you can see well if you're stressed out, fight or flighting, and constricting the eye if we're resting and digesting, because we don't need to let a lot of extra light in if we're relaxed and not needing to use our vision very closely. So sympathetic, active during emergency situations for fight or flight, increases the heartbeat, dilates the airways, inhibits digestion and urinary organs. So we're not thinking about digesting food or urinating when we're getting ready to fight or flight. The neurotransmitter released by neurons in the fight or flight is norepinephrine. So you've heard of epinephrine before, maybe epi, or another name for that is adrenaline. So we give that to people that are, having a low heart rate, low blood pressure. We'll give them epinephrine to increase that heart rate and blood pressure to keep them alive in an emergency room situation. And like we said, the parasympathetic dominates when we're in a relaxed state, so it promotes the digestion of food, slows the heart rate. Obviously, this is best for the body to be in a relaxed state rather than stressed out. So we call it the rest and digest, and the main neurotransmitter from those neurons that is released to the synapse is acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is, when it acts on the heart or the lungs, will act to rest, digest, slow the heart rate, constrict the lungs, the airways, I should say, of the lungs if acetylcholine binds to those cells of those organs. So the rest of your notes here talk about drug therapy and drug abuse, and that is going to be a special assignment that we'll have this semester. So if you want to just read through these, you'll each be assigned one of these drugs to kind of look at and prepare a little report on. So I'll stop at this point and leave the rest of the notes for your individual review.